IGN had a half-hour interview with Gabe Newell and Robin Walker about Half-Life Alyx and Valve. This video will summarise it. The feeling I got is that Gabe is living about 15 years in the future in some Matrix-like reality, and that Robin is the one who has to try and convert this all into fun gaming experiences for us all to enjoy. There are key bits of this interview where I suggest you check out the main video because words can only describe so much of what Gabe is saying. But I'll let you know when those times are. Gabe said that it's a huge amount of fun to work in the Half-Life universe again. It symbolises that they found some new game design challenges, and Half-Life is like the crowbar they're using to tackle them, and I assume to make them into a fun playable concept. He wasn't surprised when Robin told him it was VR, since it can greatly improve a single-player immersive experience, and he thinks people will realise that when they play it. As Robin kept telling himself, as long as it's good, fans will be happy. Gabe couldn't be happier with it, but he says newer members of the team were afraid with the challenge of living up to the series' expectations. He urges people to tell him what they think of it by sending him an email. A lot of Gabe's day is spent on his email or trying to solve problems which aren't super obvious. He's working on brain-computer interfaces at the moment. Gabe does all sorts of stuff in Valve, ranging from dealing with personnel issues to press. He varies it up because it keeps it fun. He describes his job as being like playing a game, except on steroids. Rather than looking back at what they've done, they look ahead at what the future challenges they might face will be. As an example, rather than thinking about how their past stuff has changed the world, he'll instead work on figuring out why Artifact was a disappointment, because that helps them more when it comes to making better decisions in the future. He says you learn more from failure than you do from success. Before Valve, Gabe worked for Microsoft on Windows. People didn't believe an operating system could handle intensive games, so they ported Doom to show it could. Game dev said he'd have more fun making video games, so he contemplated whether it was a good business venture, but also saw it as a good reason to play games. He self-funded Half-Life 1 with his Microsoft money, and he says that being private helps them to have as few people between themselves and their products and customers as possible, meaning they get to make the product for the people who are going to be using it. The alternative, I assume, would be something like shareholders, who might be more short-term and profit-driven, which might not always benefit the way that Valve do things. For a while they had publishers, but that was a headache too. I suppose you could see Steam was their way of going publisher-free. I suggest you watch from 8:56 to 9:37. Gabe speaks about how he can't think of a better way to spend a few decades than with game developers, and how he's still in touch with the co-founder of Valve, Mike Harrington. His responses are quite moving. Gabe says that they achieved stuff with Half-Life 2 and then the episodes, but after 2 of these they decided that this approach would be better suited to a connected economy in a multiplayer environment, which I guess led to stuff like the hats in Team Fortress 2 and the skins in Operations in CSGO. I got the impression from the interview that they didn't even seriously consider Half-Life 3 until VR came along. But once it did, it seemed like the perfect match, since they felt really strongly that VR would open up new and exciting opportunities. Modders have been responsible for many of Valve's game series. Robin explains these people might not have had the resources to build a full game, but they might have had a lot of ideas and later went on to form indie studios, and he told Gabe that they should pay more attention to these types of people because they do all kinds of interesting stuff. A few years ago, Valve acquired the Campo Santo game dev studio, who were working on Firewatch at the time. Gabe explained that an acquisition isn't financially driven, or about the games that they've developed, but instead because they like the people in the organisation they're acquiring. After a lot of chatting to the guys at Campo Santo, they decided they were the perfect fit for Valve. Gabe describes game development as a bit like married life, in that they've got to be able to tolerate spending 40, 60, 80 hours a week with those people that they're working with. In Valve's case, it sounds like they enjoy it. So the guys from Campo Santo helped to finish off Half-Life Alyx, and integrated a lot of their ideas from Firewatch into it. Robin talks about how the development team comprised of a bunch of people who had worked on older Half-Life games, and yes, Ricochet too.
Experienced Ricochet developers. So.
I'm just going to continue on.
And others from the Firewatch team who came along with very different narrative forms. The result is a new blend of narrative for Half-Life Alyx, which Robin says contains a lot more, and more dynamic, narrative than in previous games in the series. When it comes to constructing Half-Life Alyx, they went back and looked at all of the Half-Life games and cherry-picked what worked best from each. Robin said that some things seemed better on paper, but in practice weren't as good and you couldn't quite understand why at the time. They've had the time to pick the best of everything this time. Half-Life Alyx is also better because the team developing it has gotten better than they used to be, and the new developers help bring something fresh to the experience. Robin comments that from his point of view as a game dev, he remembers less about the game and more about periods of time when a set of people worked on solving a problem of some sort. Gabe also shares the kinds of experiences that arise from game development, which I can summarise as
Gabe likes Miracle Whip.
Gabe just sees consoles as a way of delivering games to people. He's more interested in what their design means for game devs. I recall him having some strong negative opinions about the PlayStation 3 back in the day because it was hell to develop for with its custom multi-threaded processor. But he says that their hardware is becoming increasingly similar to those found in PCs, and that's good news for game devs. He doesn't explain what's new with Source 2, but Gabe pretty much says that they've done some stuff to Source 2 for Half-Life Alyx, and that the engine will be licensed out to other developers. And if there's interest in it, then Valve will invest more into it. But I got the impression that they're not that interested in what other developers do with it. Source 2 is something Valve has made for Valve, and if other people like it then great, but it's not a priority for them unless they get told that. If given a choice between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2, Gabe chooses Portal 2. He prefers it because he did less on it, so is more easily able to appreciate it for what it is. He says that when you work on something, it's never really finished, only abandoned. So with the Half-Life games, he can see all of the compromises, the flaws and the mistakes. But with Portal 2, he's all like,
That's pretty good. Good job, guys.
but he still says that Alyx is the best. Jocularly. Seriously. Right now, Gabe pretty much only plays Dota 2 and rather jokingly can't imagine why anybody would play anything other than that. But Robin thinks that's sad because he thinks there are many good games out there. When asked which Half-Life game was closest to Half-Life 3, aside from Half-Life Alyx, Gabe seems confused by the question and says that Alyx is the closest and that it's a progression. Half-Life as a series is about solving interesting problems. And while that's the case with its gameplay, I think he's saying that from a developer's point of view. The Half-Life games have typically introduced a new element, be it physics or VR, and Alyx represents the collection of interesting problems and solutions that they've used to transform it into a gaming feature. He then goes on to say that they don't crank out Half-Life games for the money. He then talks about how much of a risk Half-Life Alyx is. More as how, from their point of view, they won't know if Half-Life Alyx is the right direction to take the series until fans have played it and given them feedback about it. He explains how they've made mistakes like Steam machines. He doesn't even beat about the bush. He calls Artifact a great disappointment, and that they screwed things up. I suggest you watch this next bit of the interview for yourselves. It's powerful to hear him talking about it so earnestly and with genuine interest in what the community will think of Half-Life Alyx. And they want to know if they're on the right track or if they're just out of touch with the community. It's time to release the game out into the world and to see what people think of it. How the community receives it is going to affect every internal conversation at Valve for the next 18 months.
This is actually a really powerful moment for us. This is as good as we get. We want people to come back and say, oh my god, the magic still is there. I think we've nailed it.
They're not expecting it to sell well, but they'll gauge its success by how much the people who play it enjoy it, and not from the sales numbers, which will no doubt be constrained by the current state of VR adoption. When asked what they want to do in the next 10 years, Gabe thinks that Valve as a company is productive, a great place to work and will continue to grow. Robin says he wants to make more Half-Life, which he thinks turned out amazingly, and they're as tooled up as they've been in a while. Gabe believes the Valve Index is a good step forward for them to use to develop products around, and that they need to do more with that. And brain-computer interfaces.
You really want to go down the rabbit hole?
For a few minutes, why not? I mean, we don't get to talk to you very often.
Oh yes, Gabe talks about this throughout the interview. It's the big challenge that he returns to whenever he's got spare time and isn't playing Dota 2. It seems more important to him than anything else. It looks to be the next step beyond VR. With the Valve Index, you can see, hear and interact with objects convincingly, but brain-computer interfaces will be the big leap beyond that. To put it into perspective, he says that when it arrives, it will be an extinction-level event for any entertainment business that isn't doing it. And if they're not thinking about it now, they will be. He says that we're way closer to the Matrix than people realise, but it won't be the Matrix because that misses the interesting technical subtleties that make up how weird this new world is going to be, but it'll have a huge impact on the experiences that they can create for people. So what is it exactly? I'm not sure if he's talking about something that can pick up brain signals, or if he's suggesting something that can create brain signals. He goes off on tangents about it throughout the video, like how he explains that visual and motor stuff is easy to do, but getting somebody to feel cold is harder because your brain receives inputs from various places, including your immune system. He's excited about it, and it shows. So it sounds like a fully immersive world without the same limitations or rules as the one that we currently live in. It may have the wrong connotations, but when listening to him describe it, the word drug came to mind. He likened brain-computer interfaces to trying to describe the internet to somebody who doesn't use the internet. Once they know it allows for rapid transport of information, they'd understand that it would help them to do stuff that they can do already, like cookery recipes, but they probably wouldn't have thought of Uber or automatic car updates, even though those things have proven to be incredibly useful. The next bit is my speculation about it, because it's too exciting not to speculate about. What Gabe was saying reminded me a lot of what Jeff Bezos said in his plans for space travel. In Jeff's presentation, he said how he didn't see his purpose as being to find uses for space travel, but rather about lowering its barrier of entry and making it as accessible to as many people as possible in order to let them to find uses for it. He said how it'll be the next generations who will find the best ways of utilising it. Jeff just saw it as his mission to enable them. While I don't know Gabe's master plan for brain-computer interfaces, if it's anything like what Valve's been doing with Steam and VR, it could be about building a platform for it which other people can use. If you want my opinion on it, it does seem scary. Listening to Gabe talking about these things, he's 10 steps ahead of the rest of us. It seems like, to him, VR is old hat. He's already trying to advance things to the next stage beyond that. I don't know how I feel about computer systems which can tap directly into my brain. But then I know people who feel that way about VR, and I'm cool with that. So who knows? Check out the interview here.